Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Made in New England interview series, where we talk with New England-based companies and the people who are leading them. I'm your host, Steve DeVries, and today I'm joined by Peter Schmidt, co-founder and COO at Transcend Air Corporation. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Really glad to be here.
All right. Maybe you could start us off and tell our guests, our listeners, a little bit about you and Transcend Air.
Absolutely. So you may not be surprised by this number. It still surprises me, but given the white in my beard, I emigrated to New England 40 years ago in 1984 to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I started out as a physics major, and then I switched to computer science and still graduated in 4 years, which I do not recommend to any of our listeners or their children or grandchildren. It was intense, but I embarked on a startup career. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and so I started out in high tech software and networking. One of my companies played a small but non-zero role in the creation of the internet. But I'm also a pilot, and I'm an aerobatic pilot, meaning I fly upside down and sideways for fun. And so when I had the chance 15 years ago to switch career paths to aerospace and aviation, I leapt at it. And I took over in a turnaround capacity as president and COO of a company named Linear Air, which is still based out of Hanscom, here in the Boston suburbs, Hanscom Air Force Base, also civil airfield. And that was my first experience with the realities of running businesses in aviation, and thereby hangs a tale.
Wow. So I grew up very close to Hanscom Air Force Base, so small world. So you've clearly had an interesting career so far. Tell us a little bit about Transcend Air and what's driving your success with that business up to this point.
Absolutely. So Transcend is a startup still. We have about 9 people full time, although we have a terrific network of advisors, consultants, contractors, and suppliers. I find I have to talk to about 45 people on a monthly basis to keep all the plates spinning around here. There's about $16 million of R&D spend into the company at this point. And depending on where you want to draw the starting point for this, it's been about a decade working on this problem. And the problem we're trying to solve is really just getting people from Boston to Manhattan in under 30 minutes for less than it currently costs you to take the Acela or the airlines. So provide a faster, cheaper, and much better travel alternative for regional travel.
And what does that look like?
It looks like what you see over my shoulder on this video. And for those who are listening on the podcast, let me describe it to you. You've all seen business jets, and they vary in size from things that are almost the size of an airliner down to things that you can almost park on your driveway. And so the aircraft we're making is at the smaller end of that spectrum. It's about the size of, I don't know, call it a Winnebago. So it's that kind of size. You can still park in your driveway, but it'd fill the driveway pretty good. And it is comparable to the executive helicopters that people fly today. It also has 2 engines made by GE right here in Lynn, Massachusetts. And when I say has, I should be clear that we've designed this aircraft and we've built a lot of subscale flying prototypes of this aircraft, but we haven't yet built a full-scale prototype. That's what comes next. But getting back to the problem we're solving, so imagine you have this aircraft that can seat 7 people in business class comfort, and it takes off and lands vertically like a helicopter, but the wing tilts down and it turns into a very high speed, jet speed turboprop aircraft. And by operating that way, you don't have to go to airports. So the picture behind me is our concept of what you call a vertiport, for vertical takeoff and landing airport, a vertiport. It's our concept of a vertiport moored at the end of Boston's Fish Pier in the seaport. And that is my target location to operate out of. So if you work in the seaport or if you work in Post Office Square in downtown Boston, you can walk to the vertiport, get on your scheduled flight to Manhattan, and you'll be an hour door to door. So imagine that, 1 hour door to door. You never had to go to an airport. You never had to sit in traffic. You never had to stand in line for security. You didn't have to stand in line to board the aircraft. There's no overhead bins to wrestle with. And you and I could sit across from each other in this aircraft and stretch our legs out. We wouldn't be able to touch our feet. So, like I said, cheaper, faster, better.
So that sounds amazing. I don't have business in Manhattan currently, but I want to, just so I can fly on your aircraft.
Yeah,
No
exactly.
airports, no security, just straight up comfort.
Exactly. And low cost. Because the other thing people think when they see a cool aircraft that looks like a business jet is that it must be expensive, like flying privately is expensive. And it's
Hmm,
not. You had said that you like metrics and that your listeners like metrics. Well, here's the metric.
absolutely.
One-way ticket Boston to New York for 5 to 10% less than the cost of an Uber to the airport plus a current airline ticket plus an Uber on the far side. That's our target metric. And I quit my day job when I had the first model of that airline business that showed we could achieve that and make a good profit. So that's the key. And that's what makes it cheaper. And unless it's cheaper door to door, it becomes a luxury good and people aren't that interested.
Well, it makes total sense. What I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is that you can create an aircraft and have the you call it a vertiport,
Yep.
door to door, and you can still do that more cost effectively than the airlines with existing infrastructure. So
Yeah. Well, so here's the key. We're not doing it more cost effectively than the airlines alone. We're competing with the door to door hard dollar travel cost. So I'm also competing with the ground travel at each end. And that's the Achilles heel of modern air travel. It's the airports. It's getting to and from that seat in coach. Once you're sitting in coach, it works fine. It's uncomfortable. It's been made uncomfortable on purpose so that you'll pay for upgrades, but it works fine. The problem is getting in and out of that seat. That's where all the hassle, that's where all the wasted time is. And because of the ground transportation cost, which is increasing now that Uber and Lyft are seeking to actually be profitable after 14 years, it turns out that that's opened a window we can compete and walk through and compete with.
so I think I speak for most people when I say that this is a little bit mind blowing that you can have something so superior to what we've known for so long and it's not going to cost a premium. So I'm still
Exactly.
trying to get my head around that a little bit. And maybe that leads into the next question that I have for you is what excites you most about the future of the business?
Well, this is exactly what excites me most. It's disrupting the current aviation model. The current aviation model is, it's designed to make profits for a small oligopoly of very large companies. And it does that by purposely causing us inconvenience and suffering. And as an engineer originally, although an MBA later, I still object to that, right? I don't think it's clever to create a transportation system where people pay extra to not be uncomfortable, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. So it's a classic tale of innovation. Now, we haven't invented anything. This is not coming out of an MIT lab deep in the basement with something new in a beaker or in a semiconductor fab. We're taking off the shelf parts, but we're putting them together in a new and novel way based on the understanding that this business model is achievable. So it's an innovation play. It's not an invention play, if I can make that distinction. Now, that said, we do have a bunch of patents, primarily around the software that is the soul of this aircraft. This is a computerized fly-by-wire aircraft, as all new aircraft under development are. And there's novel things we had to learn and discover and invent in order to implement software that could control an aircraft that can take off and land like a helicopter and then tilt its wing down and fly like an airplane. So we do have some protectable intellectual property. That's a key part of our strategy too. But fundamentally, what I'm excited about is the knock-on effects of us operating this business for regional transportation. So it's not just Boston to New York. It's New York to DC. It's Boston to DC. It's Atlanta to Orlando. It's San Francisco to San Diego. But it's not San Francisco to Dallas. And it's not Chicago to Boston. Right? There are always trade-offs in engineering. And in this case, the trade-off is if you don't want to go to airports, then you need to use aircraft that are small enough that you don't need something that looks like an airport. And that's a key understanding as well.
So
But
as you envision, your business sort of just rolling out, right? And you've got
yep,
this fleet of regional aircraft.
Yep.
running the routes that you're describing, what does that look like? Is it one going and one coming type of thing? Is it
Yep.
just multiples, like boom, boom, like one after the other? Like, do you see a lot of volume and just a lot of aircraft, or do you see it as being a little bit more selective?
No, your intuition is exactly right. So all of those things are true. It is one coming and one going at the same time, which we refer to as symmetrical demand and symmetrical service. And the reason that's critical is that when you fly an aircraft that doesn't have people in it, you're losing money. So that's the Achilles heel of using small fixed wing airplanes, as we say, to try and offer this service, is that they end up having to move empty a lot of the time. And that's what I learned the hard way prior to launching Transcend. So we discovered that there is a high volume of symmetrical demand in business travel from major city to major city. And you can see that in Bureau of Transportation Statistics data, which airlines are required to report. So this is as hard as the data gets. And every day, over 5,000 people get on an airplane in New York City and fly to Boston. And the same is true. Over 5,000 people get on an airplane in Boston and fly to New York. It's symmetrical, which is good, because if it wasn't symmetrical, we might end up filling up Boston with Yankees fans. That'd be no good. So
Probably not good.
Symmetry is the first part. Multiple aircraft is the next. These are small aircraft. So we have essentially the same overhead as Delta does to operate a flight. We can use one pilot instead of two. So we have half the pilot cost, but we have 7 passengers instead of over 100, right? So it's fewer than a 20th of the number of passengers. So that being the case, we need to fly a lot of aircraft. Now, as we scale up across our route network, I've calculated that we can get to $1 billion in ticket revenues before we put enough stress on the air traffic control system with our bunches of small aircraft that the FAA has to hire even one additional air traffic controller. And then as we grow from $1 billion towards the $10 billion number, which is our target, so that's ticket revenues in the United States, once we get beyond $1 billion, yes, then we have to hire more air traffic controllers. We might even be looking at modifying some of the software they use. But we're not the only ones looking at this, and I have the FAA's expert is one of our advisors on this, so we're way ahead of this. I mean, we're talking more than 10. Well, that would be more like 12 to 13 years from now. So we've got lots of time.
So this all sounds amazing, but I have to ask, what's holding you back from being in business, commercial business today?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's holding us back is 2 things. First, you have to get the design correct. And designing a new aircraft like this yields to competence. And we've been fortunate in attracting a team that is made up of a small handful of the people who are the best in the world in each discipline that matters. And the reason that we've attracted the best of the best is that they also think this is amazing and want to fly on it as I do, and everybody who hears about it does. And they also ask their hard questions about our approach to the design, each from their own perspective. It turns out we have really good answers for all of those. This is as real as it can get. We're not counting on any unobtainium. We're not making any ridiculous assumptions or hoping that magical physics will appear to save a problem with our design. None of that. So we've got the best of the best working on this. And fortunately, in a way, we've been grinding with a small, very focused team up to this point. And I say in a way because if we'd been handed, say, $100 million 5 years ago, the design was not ready. I didn't realize, not being an experienced aerospace guy, but coming out of high tech, I didn't realize how much more had to be figured out. So it's a good thing that we weren't given the money 5 years ago. I would have very much liked it 2 years ago. So the thing we're struggling with is it is next to impossible to fund any hardware startup in the United States. Silicon Valley has been corrupted, and I do not use that term loosely. It has been corrupted by software and social media plays that have hit it big. And so all the VCs want very low capital usage in their investments, right? They all want to replicate TikTok or Facebook before it. So then you add on the fact that it's aerospace, and the people who have been brave enough to invest in aerospace programs over the past couple of decades have almost all been burned. And the reason they've been burned is that the makers of aircraft are not the same people as the operators of aircraft. And the makers of aircraft don't actually understand, as it turns out, what it takes to succeed in operating the aircraft. So they keep designing aircraft for which there will be no successful economic model. And I could give you example after example of that. We're unique in that my co-founder, Greg Brule, who built a 2,000-pound flying prototype VTOL aircraft, reached out to me early on because he's also a successful serial entrepreneur. He was very aware of all the failures in aviation and he didn't want to replicate it. And so we have a founding team that consists of me, who ran and operated aircraft, and somebody who built novel aircraft. That makes us unique. So what comes down to, you can build way more aircraft that will fly than can ever yield a profit for anybody. But we started with a profitable business model, and I mean literally business model. It has 52 tabs now in my giant Excel spreadsheet. And we said, what are the characteristics for an aircraft that would meet this business model? And it turns out it's vertical takeoff and landing, because we need access to high demand. And high demand is found in the centers of cities. It's like Willie Sutton said, he robs banks because that's where the money is.
Right.
Operate out of the center of city because that's where the travel demand is. Once you have enough demand, then the question becomes, how much, in our case, how many flights do you have to do per day in order to generate enough operating margin to cover your overhead and make a profit, right? It's no different than any other capital intensive business. If you have a factory making widgets, every minute your widget making machinery is idle, you're losing money. Or the same is true in real estate. You know, if you've got rental properties and they're empty half the year, you're losing your shirt. So once we found this deep well of demand, 5,000 people going back and forth every day between Boston and New York on the airlines, there's another 20,000 taking the trains. And we don't know how many drive and take buses, but it's a lot.
So let's pause right there for just a second.
Yeah.
You just said, so you've got 25,000 people documented in some way, shape, or form going back and forth between Boston and New York every single day.
On average, yep.
Wow. So that number right there just kind of blew me away a little bit. That's a lot of people. And that's your target market for this particular region.
It's our example target market. Absolutely. And one of the reasons we live here, so that's one of the reasons why it's our target market. But it's also the case that Boston, New York is the best served transportation market in the country. We have effective trains, both high speed and regional rail, although it's high speed in air quotes. But they're still very nice. I took the train last week. I traveled all around. I went down to Philly, DC, and New York, and then back up here, and it was all train. But you can drive yourself. Highways do that. You can take two kinds of buses. You can take very low cost Greyhound-esque buses, or you can take these limo liners that are almost like being in business class on the airline. And then you can fly, regular airline service, coach, and business class even. So with all these options, you get a very good set of price points. And in our case, I showed price point versus door-to-door time. And what we're doing is breaking that curve. There's a nice curve that they fall on. If you drive yourself, it's cheap, but it's going to take you 4 or 5 hours. Same with the cheap bus. You can get on the train, you might do it in 4 hours, it's more expensive. Sell it, maybe it's 3.5 hours, it's a bit more expensive. Then you get to the airline and you're back to 3 to 4 hours, depending on the time of day and how congested things are. So we targeted beating the airlines because we know how many people are flying, and that's a big market. And so we're able to do that, but we can do that with 1 hour door-to-door instead of 4. So we'll cut your door-to-door time by 80%.
Sorry.
The last thing I was going to say is just so when you contextualize the amount of people traveling, so 50,000 people, the greater New York area is population of around 10 million, and Metro Boston is around, I think, 3 to 4 million now. And so, 50,000 people traveling is, it's a half of, can I do this math on a podcast? So 100,000 is 10% of a million. We're talking 15 million. So we've got 5% of a million. So we got 5% of a 15th of that. So we're talking a fraction of a percent of the population traveling back and forth every day.
Wow. So, as I sit here and I listen to I guess what really is the value proposition, right? So it's cheaper,
Yep.
faster,
Yep.
more comfortable, right? So I think about a conversation I had years and years ago, early in my career, with a potential supplier. This happened to be a machine shop. And he drew a triangle in front of me and he says, "You're young, so I'm going to explain this to you." He says, "You have price, you have quality, and you have delivery. And each one of those is a point on a triangle." He said, "You can only have two of any of those points." And I chuckled just like you did, and I politely took the pen from his hand and I drew a circle around it. I said, "If you want to do business with me, I need all three." And
Yep.
that's what you're doing. You're bringing all three effectively to these people who need high quality, fast, affordable transportation back and forth. So I think that's a fantastic business model.
And
Um,
and Steve,
so,
you know where that came from. We now have lean manufacturing.
oh yeah.
Prior to lean manufacturing, we called it total quality management.
Mhm.
Um, there was a very influential book called Quality is Free, written by a guy named Joe Duran back in, I think, the 1980s. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have.
Yeah. So his thesis was how you get what you just said. How do you draw that circle around it? And the problem with that mindset was always that you were fixing problems after they happened. You were trying to inspect quality into products. And Duran
Right.
said, no, what you do is you re-engineer your process so the problem can't happen. And that's what ends up making it cheaper, faster, better. And so that's what we've done is we've engineered the flying process so that the problem, which is getting to and from the airports, can't happen. So
Very
that's
cool.
kind of the fundamental.
So two last questions for me. So number one, you're a New England-based business. You mentioned earlier, that you have your roots here. How has that impacted the efforts of your business, pros or cons, being here in New England?
Well, the big pro is that there are a lot of very smart people who live here in our networks over the years that we've been able to draw upon. Um, the the con is that it is not a center for aerospace manufacturing. The nearest one of those is Montreal, which is not far away. So we do have pretty deep ties up there, and the food's good in Montreal as well. So they're the pros and cons, and there is support. One of the organizations I'm a part of is called Mass Autonomy. It's a nonprofit that is sort of fostered to accelerate Massachusetts as a leader in this new aviation world that encompasses not just our aircraft, but of course drones, and people who have visions for electric aviation of various kinds. So we'll see what form that takes in terms of our leadership. But because of all the smart people here, I'm confident we're going to find some really unique new avenues.
Nice. Well, I think having the partnership in Montreal is fine as long as you don't show up wearing black and gold, as we
No,
all know.
no.
And so,
Careful.
yeah. So, last question for all of our listeners out there: any advice that you would have for the serial entrepreneurs? You described yourself as a serial entrepreneur,
Yes.
taking on a really large venture, which is what I see yours being it's a large venture. What do you have for those types of serial entrepreneurs that are thinking really big about disrupting an industry?
Uh, I guess I have two. One is trust the experience you've built up through both any successes you've had and the failures you've had. In fact, the failures have probably taught you more useful things for this big swing at the fences than your successes did. The other one for younger entrepreneurs who might aspire to become serial entrepreneurs is understand and cultivate your relationships in your ecosystem, because you're going to come back to them over and over again. In particular, cultivate relationships with investors and patrons who have a lot of wealth, because when you do the grand startup later on, they could be very helpful to you.
Great advice. So everybody, today our guest has been Peter Schmidt of Transcend Air Corporation. Peter, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story with us.
Yes, and if people want more, they can go to transcend.aero. That's transcend.aero.
Fantastic. So everybody out there, go check out transcend.aero. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll be back soon with another episode. Take care.